Hello everyone and welcome to Green Magic, your source for all things green and magic. Alright everyone, so this episode will be about cost reducers. This is part 9 of the Mana Ramp series. And for those of you not terribly familiar with what I mean by that, it's basically just cards that say your next spell costs this less, or these spells cost this less. So you actually probably do see these with some degree of frequency. They do show up in Commander a decent amount, but they may be something that's a little bit underutilized or overlooked by some people when deck building. You may not necessarily gravitate towards these as something that you just inherently think of to include in a deck. Let's start with a few of the ones though that if you happen to be building these decks, you would almost certainly realize what you're doing and what you're going for. Starting with Gargos, Vicious Watcher. It's a 6 mana, including triple green, 8/7 legendary Hydra. It has Vigilance. Hydra spells you cast cost 4 less to cast, and whenever a creature you control becomes the target of a spell, Gargos, Vicious Watcher fights up to one target creature you don't control. Now, as you can see, this creature is the commander of about 2/3 as many decks as it appears in the 99. So 40% roughly of the decks this card is in, it's the commander of. Obviously, when this card came out last year, it really sparked a lot of interest in Hydra Tribal. If you look on the various websites, most people name their deck some variation of Hail Hydra. So this one, you can take it in a couple different routes. I haven't built the deck myself because I'm a little bit undecided on which way I want to go, but the direction that most people take it in is the Hydra route, and this one actually there are a couple of other Hydras that are legendary and can be commanders, but this one cares about Hydra Tribal by making all of your Hydra creatures cost 4 less. So this one is strictly tribal. It doesn't apply to anything else that you're going for. Any of your like instant sorceries, other creatures that you might have, it's all in on Hydras. And the next one is kind of similar. Knight of the Stampede, 4 mana, including a single green. It's a 2/4 human knight. Dinosaur spells you cast cost 2 less to cast. So another tribal one. All of these on this page are all tribals. The other 3, including this one, are not legendary, so they are not the commanders themselves, but they definitely go in the 99 of the appropriate tribes. So if you happen to be building a heavily dinosaur themed deck, if you notice that your deck has 20, 30, 40 dinosaurs in it, this would be a good include. If you're not going heavy into dinosaurs, it doesn't make sense. Next would be Krosan Warchief, 3 mana, including a single green, 2/2 beast. Beast spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, and you can pay 2 mana, including a single green, to regenerate target beast. So this one I really like in the same way that I like, Gargos and the next card, but I don't like Knight of the Stampede, because Knight of the Stampede isn't a dinosaur, but is there to support a dinosaur deck. So if you're building a dinosaur tribal deck, you would need at least one non-dinosaur to go in there, and to have one non-dinosaur in a dinosaur deck, that's aggravating. But Krosan Warchief is itself a beast. It makes all your beasts cheaper, and it also has the benefit of giving you the ability to regenerate beasts. So it's not just a cost reducer, but it's protection as well. It would be fantastic in a beast tribal deck. But beast tribal is not super common, so it's just not something that you're going to see too much of with any level of frequency. And then the last one is Bosk Banneret, 2 mana, including a single green, 1/3 Treefolk Shaman. Treefolk spells and Shaman spells you play cost 1 less to play. So again, this one is both tribes that it is supporting, and that's always really satisfying to include it in whatever tribe you happen to be playing. You can go either Treefolk or Shaman. Treefolk does have a couple different commanders, I think. Shaman, I don't know that there's any Shaman legendary creature that really cares about Shaman, but there are plenty of Shaman creatures within Green and in Magic as a whole. So this one would obviously be good support for that. I don't know that you're going to run a Tree Folk and Shaman deck, but if you happen to be running a dual creature tribal, I mean, the options there on this card. Moving along, you got some more of those corner case, very niche deck building types. Catalyst Stone, 2 mana artifact. Flashback cost you pay costs up to 2 less. And flashback cost your opponents pay costs 2 more. So you probably don't care about the tax you're putting on your opponents, because unless they happen to be playing a designated flashback deck, which I do realize there's been at least one commander in the last year that is all about flashbacks, you could build this as a hate bearer against that player or against that deck, but I don't think that you would really want to. It's not super useful for that purpose. Chances are you're going to include this in your own deck if you happen to be playing, I mean, obviously, if you are playing flashback, and the second half of it just isn't going to be terribly relevant. Maybe your opponents have 1 or 2 flashback spells within their deck just naturally, just as it happens, and this will tax it a little bit, maybe stall them a tiny bit, but it's mostly going to be the first half that you're going to use in your own flashback deck. And then Dream Chisel, also 2 mana artifact. Face down creature spells you play cost 1 less to play. So this one's all about morph decks. I know there's been a recent morph commander. Neither of these 2 cards are seeing a whole lot of play, even despite the 2 relatively recent commander products that focused on these mechanics. So that's a little bit strange. You would think that more people would choose to include it within those decks, but outside of those, outside of a morph deck, what are you going to do with this card? Then Obscuring Aether, a single mana. It is green. It's an enchantment. It says face down creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, and you can pay 2 mana, including a single green, to turn this card, the Obscuring Aether, face down, and then it becomes a 2/2 creature. Again, it's just for morph decks, not super helpful or pointful outside of a morph deck. Then Long Forgotten Gohei, 3 mana artifact. Arcane spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Spirit creatures you control get +1/+1. So that entire Kamigawa block, that's full of arcane and spirit stuff. And if a lot of those commanders from those sets really care about, I mean, they are super tribal focused on spirits and a little bit of arcane. So if you're playing, and back in those days, there weren't a whole lot of legendary creatures that would come out with each set. I mean, starting with Dominaria and recent sets, Wizards is putting out a lot of legendary creatures each set to appeal to commander players directly. But Kamigawa was one of the few sets outside of the last couple of years where they did include a ton of legendary stuff. And so if you were to look at the catalog of creatures, of legendary creatures, of potential commanders that are more than 2 years old, a huge percentage of them are just going to come straight out of the Kamigawa block, and a good number of those care about arcane and spirit creatures. So quantity-wise, there are a lot of things that do care about those 2 tribal things, but they're not super commonly played, they're not popular, they're not exciting, and Arcane does not have a whole lot of support. Spirit maybe a little bit more, but Arcane is not a very deep card pool. Moving on, Memory Crystal, 3 mana artifact. All buyback costs are reduced by 2. So yeah, if you're playing buyback tribal, if there's something about the buyback mechanic that you want to go all in on, one thing I'll point out is that some of the other cards on this list, you see Flashback was in a recent Commander product, and Morph was in a recent Commander product. Maybe Buyback will be something that's featured in an upcoming Commander product. So maybe this one will have a deck coming soon within the next year or 2 that it will just slot right into and make a lot of sense. But as it stands, you may have a couple cards in a deck just incidentally that have buyback, but you're probably not playing a deck with just a bunch of buyback cards for no reason. Unless you just happen to really want to dive into that mechanic, in which case this card is perfect for you. Then there's Heartstone, 3-mana artifact. The cost of each creature ability requiring an activation cost is reduced by 1. This cannot reduce an ability's generic mana cost to less than 1. So this one is not so much about casting things as it is about reducing the cost of activated abilities. So this one has a lot more broad use, especially if your commander itself has some sort of activated ability where you're paying a cost to it. If it's something like pay 2 mana and create a token, or like Urza, pay a few mana and do the whole shuffle and then reveal the top card of your library thing. Or like a Sliver Queen or something that just has an activated ability of some kind. This can reduce the cost of it so that you can do it, way more and get more value out of that thing. Or if you just happen to be playing a deck full of activated abilities. If I'm not mistaken, one of the recent companions, for as long as those cards remain legal and in their current function, at least one of them has a requirement to be your companion. Every card in your deck has to have an activated ability. So you could already be looking at a deck that basically does this. Although I believe that specific companion says that each card has to have an activated ability. So if you were to build that, Heartstone doesn't technically have an activated ability. It just cares about other things that do, so you wouldn't be able to include it in that deck. But if you're going down the route of that type of deck building, or you're trying to kind of go for that anyway, but maybe you can't quite reach the point where every card in your library has an activation cost, so you're not quite able to reach that companion requirement, Heartstone would slot into the deck and make sense as a good include. Moving on, Urza's Incubator is a 3-mana artifact. When it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Creature spells of the chosen type cost 2 less to cast. Pure tribal thing, but it's open-ended. It's not something that's tied into a specific mechanic or tribe like some of the previous things. This one is open-ended. It's a colorless artifact, so it goes in any color or multicolored, and you choose the creature type, whatever it is you want to be running. So this is almost an auto include in any tribal deck. There's not much reason not to play it besides budget reasons, or if you're just trying to not be overly cliche, I guess. The other argument would be if you're playing something that's very low to the ground, like elves. If you're playing a bunch of 1 and 2 cost creatures, then you don't need this. But if you're playing anything big, if you're playing dragons, worms, beasts, demons, anything that's going to be, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 plus mana, then great card to include. Next, Herald's Horn, 3-mana artifact. As it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Creatures spells you cast of the chosen type cost 1 less to cast. And at the beginning of your upkeep, look at the top card of your library. If it's a creature card of the chosen type, you may reveal it and put it into your hand. So, both of these cards cost 3 mana. Both of them have a reduction. Although the Incubator is a reduction of 2 and Horn is a reduction of 1. Horn gives you potential card advantage because it gets you sometimes an extra card off the top of your library. It doesn't draw the cards, so if there happens to be an effect saying your opponents can only draw 1 card per turn or something like that, this doesn't get held against you. Both of these cards would kind of go hand in hand. I would think that if you're playing one, you'd probably want the other. As I mentioned with Urza's Incubator, that one doesn't quite fit with really small, low-costed creature types. So if you happen to be running a tribe where everything is 2 mana, 1 color, and then 1 generic, then Herald's Horn would make more sense, whereas Urza's Incubator wouldn't. So in that very small case, you might want to just have the Herald's Horn. But almost in every instance, if you're going to have one, you should have both. There's no reason outside of budget to exclude one over the other. These are both just great tribal cards. So next are some things that will pretty much just reduce the cost of creatures. Starting with Nylea Keen-Eyed, 4 mana, including a single green. It's a legendary enchantment creature, God, 5/6. It's indestructible, and as long as your devotion to green is less than 5, it isn't a creature. Creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, and for 3 mana, including a single green, reveal the top card of your library. If it's a creature card, put it into your hand. Otherwise, you may put it into your graveyard. That's a may, so you could just leave it on top of your library if you want to keep it there. So this is one that I've already built as a commander deck, and to me, it makes a lot of sense as just being straight value. If you're running a ton, I put it in an existing deck that had as many creatures as I could possibly have to maximize the value of the cost reduction. Also, at the same time, making it so that I'm most likely to have a creature on top of my library so that when I pay the activation cost, if I need to, I'm almost certainly going to hit a creature. So this one just wants to be in a very creature-heavy deck. The more creatures you have, the better this is. It doesn't make sense to reduce the cost of, a deck with 15, 20 creatures in it. It's just not going to do very much work for you, whether it's in the 99 or the commander. Next is Duskwatch Recruiter, 2 mana, including a single green. It's a 2/2 human warrior werewolf for 3 mana, including a single green. Look at the top 3 cards of your library. You may reveal a creature card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in any order. At the beginning of each upkeep, if no spells were cast last turn, transform it. And then the back half is Crown Horde Howler, 3/3 werewolf. Creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. And at the beginning of each upkeep, if a player casts 2 or more spells, transform it. So this is in quite a few decks, which I don't get. It doesn't appeal to me having creatures that flip every turn, because that's just a nightmare to track. I've said it before, that I don't want to deal with that. But a 2 mana 2/2, which turns into a 3/3 with a discount and the ability to maybe even, get some card advantage. It's basically like a Nylea in some ways. It's just one half of it's on one side and the other half is on the other. The good side to the part with the card advantage is that you at least get to look at the top 3, so you're far more likely to get a hit. And then the cards that you don't choose go on the bottom of your library as opposed to the graveyard, which, depending on what you're doing, I generally would rather have things stay in my library than go to my graveyard. That's just a playstyle thing. Obviously, a lot of people and a lot of decks do want to fill up their graveyard. So the next card is Planar Gate, 6 mana. It's an artifact. Pay up to 2 less than required whenever you cast a summon spell. Summon spell is a creature spell, for those of you who maybe are less familiar with the old terminology. So this one just 2 less to cast a creature. That's a very good value. The only downside to this is that it costs 6 to cast, so it's not going to come out super early. So if you're playing any kind of low to the ground type deck, then you're going to cast all your creatures before this thing's even out to discount them. This would be better suited if you're playing bigger creatures, or if you've got like a variety of sizes of creatures. You have to bear in mind that you need other things to get you off to a faster start, so that if you're going to include this, it's not like you are waiting all the way till turn 6 to cast this and then get a discount for the rest of the game. Like you need other things to ramp you and to advance you, and to make sure that you are getting good value out of a reduction of 2 per creature. And then next is Conduit of Ruin, 6 mana. It's a 5/5 Eldrazi. When you cast Conduit of Ruin, you may search your library for a colorless creature card with CMC 7 or greater. Reveal it, shuffle your library, put it on top. The first creature spell you cast each turn costs 2 less to cast. Now, I think it's pretty obvious that if you're playing one of the Eldrazi commanders, this is probably going to go on that deck for a few reasons. It's a colorless creature that is an Eldrazi, so it just fits naturally in those decks, but also it's going to allow you to tutor up another Eldrazi to put on top of your library. And if you're playing an Eldrazi deck, all of your creatures are very big, and so having a discount of 2 for the first one each turn is going to be incredibly valuable to you. Even outside of an Eldrazi deck, though, I think, there's going to be some black and red and white decks that might want this. I don't think blue so much is going to usually want it. But in green, you should actually see some degree of value off of this. Just because if you have anything that's power 7 or greater, or CMC 7 or greater, excuse me, then you might want to go grab that. And in a lot of cases, that might be your Avenger of Zendikar, or your End-Raze Forerunners, or whatever big thing that you want to get, Galta. And then the ability to discount something by 2 each turn can also be super helpful, again, if you got those big creatures. Even if your deck is mostly medium creatures, medium or small, then, you can discount your 5-drop down to a 3-drop, effectively. And that's pretty useful. The only thing, though, is I wouldn't highly recommend it in most green decks, just because you have plenty of other ramp, you have plenty of other discounters, you have plenty of other everything to make casting your creatures more affordable and more, have a much bigger engine. Getting a discount of 2 on a single creature each turn isn't like over the top type big plays. It's just a reasonable thing that you could throw in as, I'd almost put it in as like a utility creature, just something to kind of give your deck a little extra value without it being something that you really count on for ramp and mana reduction and to get ahead. Moving on, Goreclaw, Terror of Sisma, 4 mana, including a single green. It's a 4/3 legendary bear. Creature spells you cast with power 4 or greater cost 2 less to cast. Whenever this attacks, each creature you control with power 4 or greater gets +1/+1 and gains trample until end of turn. So, where to even begin with this card? This card wants you to play all big creatures, power 4 or greater. If you're playing this as your commander, there's no reason to have anything that's smaller than power 4, with one exception, which we'll get to in just a moment. The way I built it, though, I did not make the exception. I kept it all power 4 or greater, and yeah, I really stuck to that restriction in my deck, because it just meant that I'm going to get the most possible value off of his first ability. And his second ability, which is also going to pump all of my creatures, and anything that didn't have trample will get trample. If he's in the 99, you're going to want him in the 99 of a deck that is already largely big creatures. I mean, if he's in the 99, I can understand being a lot less strict about, having big creatures. You could have a much greater variety of things. But he's going to be best suited. The more big creatures you have in your deck, the better he's going to be for you. That's just how the value works. Next is Rhonas' Monument, 3 mana. It's a legendary artifact. Green creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. And whenever you cast a creature spell, target creature you control gets +2/+2 and gains trample until end of turn. So, this card does see a lot of play, and I'll be honest, I think I have it in just a couple of decks, and I think I actually have Bantu's Monument in like 3 or 4 decks. So of the monuments, I have actually gone with a different one as being a favorite. Now, for the purposes of cost reduction, the other one won't help me at all. It's the other ability on the other monument that I care about. But for cost reduction, Rhonas' Monument is the card to use for green. Obviously, there's one for each color, so there's, Bantu's, there's... I should know this. I do know this. I can't think of them. Anyway, all 5 colors have one, and they all have a different ability. His happens to give one creature +2/+2 on trample till end of turn. So again, if you happen to be just casting a bunch of little creatures, then you can make one of your guys super big and trampling, or you can spread it around to buff up several of your creatures and give each of those creatures trample. It's generic value, but it's not a super strong card. At least it's not one that I've gravitated towards. Next is Krosan Drover, 4 mana, including a single green. It's a 2/2 elf. Creature spells you cast with converted mana cost 6 or more cost 2 less to cast. So, this is the exact card I mentioned in with Goreclaw that would be a great exception to the rule. I chose not to make the exception. I put a hard limit. All of my creatures in Goreclaw have to have power 4 or greater. Krosan Drover would combo very well with him because most of those creatures that are in any Goreclaw deck, if you're playing Goreclaw, are going to have CMC 6 or greater. Most of them. So, yeah, having Goreclaw and Krosan Drover is just a great pair, and it would be an all-star in that deck. I just chose not to do it, but of the 633 decks that Goreclaw is in and Krosan Drover is in a total of 472, it seems like he should be in more Goreclaw decks. He should be in probably more decks overall. Obviously, there are a handful of commanders, not just in green, but there's a few Boros ones. There's that Nylea, the red, green, white one that cares about big creatures. There's several things that are going to want him, and he should show up a little bit more often. I just assume that people aren't aware this thing exists. It's so old and it just hasn't gained popularity and just isn't well known in the format. Next is Centaur Omenreader. This one is a 3/3 Centaur Shaman. It's a snow creature. And as long as it is tapped, creature spells you cast cost 2 less to cast. So this is one that I don't like the condition, because most likely you're going to look at that and say, well, then I got to attack with it. Now, there are other ways to get around that. There are like equipment, or if you happen to have like a Cryptolith or something like that out, then you could tap it for other abilities. But then that means you need several of those effects within the deck in addition to him in order to do that. But in most cases, you're going to be tapping. The way he would become tapped is by attacking, and as a 3/3, he's kind of vulnerable. And if you do have all those things that want to tap him for other abilities, then what's your deck doing? Is it like a tap-based deck, or is it a big creatures deck? Because the discount of 2 to cast creatures seems like you would rather have medium to big creatures. I mean, I guess there are a lot of other 3-4 mana creatures that could be discounted by 2 that would also fall into a tap type theme, but I feel like it's, if you're just trying to use it as part of a big creature deck, then it would make me nervous having such a vulnerable thing. If you're doing something with a bunch of tap shenanigans and stuff, it would make sense and it could be very valuable in that deck, but you just got to make sure that the other things that you're tapping for other purposes aren't just a bunch of 1 and 2 drops, because a good chunk of them are 1, 2, and then there's some 3 and 4, but if half the creatures in that deck aren't getting value from this, then he doesn't even belong in those decks. So I do believe he has a home. I just have not, I just haven't even tried to find a home for him yet myself, but I do believe that he can certainly benefit a lot of decks. Next are a few artifacts that will just kind of generically save you mana. Helm of Awakening at 2 mana, it's an artifact. All spells cost 1 generic mana less to play. So this one is a symmetrical effect. It'll help all of your opponents and you. Of course, if you happen to play it on turn 2, then your opponents will benefit off of it first. So there's that downside. But as a 2 mana card, it's something that you can in fact get down super early, assuming it's in your opening hand or you draw it super early. And for that reason, it is very effective at being a mana reducer. Because it's a symmetrical effect, you do have to be a little bit cautious, but you would most likely want it in a deck where you have a bunch of small things where you expect your opponent is likely going to cast, one or two things per turn, but your things, which are already pretty cheap, now made one cheaper, you're going to cast 3, 4, 5 things. And if you have the card draw to match it, then you can really make good use out of it. I assume a good number of the decks that it's in are going to be those artifact decks, like Jhoira, where she says, play a artifact, draw a card. So now if you're playing a bunch of, 1 and 2 drop artifacts, then or 0 drop artifacts, then you just draw through your deck, and this will help reduce some of the mana for the ones that you do have to pay for so that you can get that engine going. But you could also do it with a Spellslinger deck if you're doing a bunch of instants and sorceries and you just want to do a lot of things repeatedly, or if you're doing a creature type deck where you just have a bunch of little creatures and you're trying to just get them out rolling and swarm the board. It can be used several ways. Next, Stone Calendar, 5 mana artifact. Your spells cost up to 1 less to cast. Casting cost of spells cannot go below 0. So this one is not symmetrical effect. It will only help you. Considering that, I would think this one should see a little bit more play. It's probably a case of just a card being old and kind of obscure, and so people overlook it. It could be the fact that it costs 5 mana, so players kind of look at it as being a little bit higher on the mana curve, kind of late for any kind of ramp. But, I mean, I think that as long as you have the ramp before it, and you have card draw, and you can kind of keep yourself afloat, then this will, once you get to the mid and late game, definitely gain you a lot of value, or it could. Definitely not for every deck, but I think it's something worth considering for a lot of decks. You might find that it performs better than what you would expect. Or you might find that it doesn't perform for you very well at all. Depends on your play style, depends on exactly how you built your deck. And then next is the Immortal Sun, 6 mana legendary artifact. Players can't activate Planeswalker's loyalty abilities. At the beginning of your draw step, draw an additional card. Spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Creatures you control get +1/+1. So this card does see a lot of play, and for good reason. It's just another one of those cards that does a lot of different things. I included it in the card draw video because it does draw you an extra card each turn, and that's fantastic. It's an anthem, so it'll buff up your creatures. So if you're playing any kind of token, go wide, or if just a bunch of little creatures, anything like that, you'll see a lot of benefit off of it. If you got like a few big creatures, then this won't really help you as much for the anthem effect. The more creatures you have, the better that effect will be. The shutting down of Planeswalkers can be huge. I know I've played this card a few times. I mean, against obviously a Super Friends deck, it's just going to shut down the deck. But even incidentally, just playing this card and then someone happens to have either a Planeswalker already in play, and I'm not even thinking about that when I play this, I just want the value of everything else, or they have a Planeswalker in their hand and then they can't do anything with it. It's great to shut off the Planeswalkers, and that's a huge benefit, or can be sometimes. The downside, though, is since this card was printed, War of the Spark was the thing, and so Planeswalkers had those static abilities, and this won't shut off that, which means that you can still have to deal with some of those very troublesome static abilities. And then, of course, the reason that it's on this list is because it will reduce the spells that you want to cast by 1, and again, this one applies to all spells, but only yours. It does not help your opponents. And yeah, definitely a very good card. Next are some things that kind of care about a card type, starting with Jhoira's Familiar, 4 mana, 2/2, artifact creature, bird. It has flying, and it says historic spells you cast cost 1 less. Historic, for those of you who don't know, are artifacts, which is where you would normally see this card. Legendaries, which you could build a deck built around legendary stuff. For example, Reki is a mono-green commander that cares about legendary things. And then there's, I can't think of it. They did it on Game Nights not too long ago. It was the Mindslaver episode. So whatever commander that was that wants you to exile cards out of your graveyard, then you can play legendary stuff out of your graveyard. And then, obviously, sagas. Now, sagas, I seriously doubt you're going to have too many of those in your deck. You probably don't have a commander deck built around sagas. There are only 24 of them in total. Sagas only existed in Dominaria and Theros Beyond Death. So they are not a highly supported card type. And, I mean, personally, I look at a lot of the ones, at least in green, and they're just meh. I don't see much benefit to including them within any of my decks. I might have a couple here or there, but this card is mostly going to see play in those heavy artifact decks where, again, like a Jhoira, where you're just casting as many cheap artifacts as possible just to cantrip and draw out your deck and do whatever artifact combo thing you're going for. Foundry Inspector, 3 mana, 3/2, artifact creature construct, artifact spells you cast, 1 less to cast. So this one does not affect legendaries or sagas, the same way Jhoira's Familiar does. So Jhoira's Familiar would discount your commander. This one wouldn't. This one doesn't have flying, but other than that, they're basically comparable. Foundry Inspector does have the benefit of costing 1 less, which can be relevant when you get it out a turn earlier, or you just get it out sooner. So that is an extra plus for it, but for the most part, if you're playing one of these, you would probably want to play both. Moving on, Primal Amulet, 4 mana artifact. Instant and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. Whenever you cast an instant or sorcery, put a charge counter on this. Then if there are 4 more charge counters on it, you may remove those and transform it. The backside, Primal Wellspring, is a land that says, tap, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. When that mana is spent to cast an instant or sorcery, copy that spell, and you may choose new targets for the copy. So this one's all about an instant or sorcery deck. If you're playing a bunch of instants and sorceries, this would be a good card. First for the discount, then if you want, you could just leave it on that side and never flip it over and just have a discount if you plan on casting a ton of things over and over. Or if you want, you can flip it over and then you can copy an important instant or sorcery. So definitely a great card if your deck is built around those one or both of those card types. I've got a few decks that use this card, and it's very useful in those decks. Next, Mana Matrix, 6 mana artifact. Pay up to 2 less than required when casting an instant, interrupt, or enchantment spell. So interrupt is basically just an instant now. It's not its own thing. And then enchantment is pretty self-explanatory. So instants and enchantments. So kind of 2 different directions that you would go in. There's a good number of enchantress decks, enchantment decks, and there are some spell slinging decks, but the spell slinging ones generally care about instants and sorceries, like the previous Primal Amulet. A lot of like fork effects will say, copy instant or sorcery. So it's a little bit of a downside that it doesn't include sorceries on that. Obviously, if you know that your deck is full of one or I guess both of those card types, then this would be a great include. If not, it's not really worth including if your deck only has like 10 instants or 5 enchantments or something. So you know if your deck wants it, and you know if your deck doesn't. Next, Herald of the Pantheon, 2 mana, including a single green. It's a 2/2 Centaur Shaman, and it says your enchantment spells you cast cost 1 less. And whenever you cast an enchantment spell, you gain 1 life. This one is very clearly, it goes in an enchantress deck. If you're playing a ton of enchantments, those decks will include the enchantresses, the ones that draw you cards for playing enchantments. This is one that'll just discount them, and also the life gain is just, a little bonus on the side that you probably don't care too much about. But obviously it goes in those kinds of decks, and that's it. If you were playing a creature-centric deck, and you just kind of looked at this and said, well, it's a creature, so it'll, draw me cards off of Guardian Project and do creature things, and I can swing with it, and when I do happen to cast the occasional enchantment, it'll discount it or gain me life. I wouldn't recommend doing that. If you're looking at it as being something that might gain you a little bit of value, then your deck is better off just casting or containing almost anything else. Put this in a designated enchantment deck. Don't include it for, the occasional minimal value in anything else. It's just, I'm pretty sure I've seen this card used quite a few times in decks where it wasn't enchantment heavy and it just doesn't make much sense. So hopefully those 5,600 decks are all enchantment decks. Next would be Semblance Anvil. It's a 3-mana artifact. It has imprint. When it enters the battlefield, you may exile a non-land card from your hand. Spells you cast that share a card type with the exiled card cost 2 less to cast. This one, so I am of the type where I don't want to generally exile a card out of my hand in order to make a card that I just play to have any kind of effect. I know that there's several cards that do that, and some of them see CDH play. I want to say, is it Mox Diamond that has that kind of effect, where you have to exile a card and then it'll tap for that color mana, and then there's another one where you have to exile a land and then it'll tap for any color that does. Obviously, Force of Will, you have to discard a card. I understand that that's an effect that is strong, I guess, in competitive play, but I'm looking at it as like a 2-for-1 against myself for no reason. And if someone happens to blow this up, then that's a huge blowback. I mean, you just lost so much with it. But if you are playing a deck that is centered around one card type, be it, artifacts, enchantments, creatures, planeswalkers, instant sorceries, whatever, this would be a great way to discount the cost on those things. But like I said, I do overlook this card because I don't want to be discarding my own stuff, or rather exiling my own stuff just to get the benefit. Next is Cloud Key, 3-mana artifact. As it comes into play, choose artifact, creature, enchantment, instant, or sorcery. Spells you play of the chosen type cost 1 less to play. So this one is basically the same thing. The discount is less. It's only 1 mana, but you don't have to lose another card to do it. You just name it. One thing that's worth pointing out is that Cloud Key does not allow for planeswalkers, I guess, but that's going to be a pretty narrow limitation. The main card types, artifact, creature, enchantment, instant, sorcery, are all there. You can choose any one of them. So this is a very broad card that could go in a ton of decks. The only downside is it is a little bit pricey. Moving on, Emerald Medallion, a 2-mana artifact. Your green spells cost 1 less to play. So the Medallion series is going to be the thing that is kind of the poster child for a cost reducer, because it's very straightforward. There's one for each color, and it's one that you're going to see from time to time at the very least. The benefit to it is that it'll apply to any green spell, so your creatures, your enchantments, your instants and sorceries, all those different things. And it only costs 2 to cast, so it will come down very early, and that's important. The downside is that it doesn't help your artifacts. So if you have no other artifacts in the deck, this can be pretty helpful. But if you've got 5, 10, I mean, I don't want to be in the position usually to have this out and then every card I draw is just the few artifacts that are in the deck and I get no value off of anything. Still a good card, and it definitely deserves play, and it's not something that I could recommend against. It just is not something that I personally gravitated towards. If you saw some of the other videos, you probably heard me speaking very highly about the things that get you lands into play, both for the card advantage and the thinning of the deck and the ramp itself. So that's obviously the direction that I've kind of gone in, and this is just in a different direction, so it's just outside of my usual playstyle. But despite that it's not a card that I use often, it is one that I recognize is going to be very valuable and benefit you in most circumstances. Next, Sealed of the Guild Pact, 5-mana artifact. As it enters the battlefield, choose 2 colors. Each spell you cast costs 1 less to cast for each of the chosen colors it is. So this one, I mean, it tells you right on there, Guild, and it has you choose 2 colors. And in the art, you can see all 10 of the guilds. So you can tell that it's designed for 2-color decks. You could put it in a 1-color, a 3-color, 4-color, 5-color, whatever, but it's going to be best suited in a 2-color deck. Now, even in a mono green deck, you could include this one as just a worse Emerald Medallion, because it would cost 5 as opposed to the 2, and it would discount all of your green cards by 1, just as the Emerald Medallion would. So it's a worse card, but, you know, redundancy is always good. You usually want this in a 2 to 3 color deck, though. Once you get up to like 4 and 5 colors, unless your deck is built in such a way to where it only kind of splashes the 3rd and 4th color or 5th color and mostly focuses on a couple, you're going to be in too many positions where, or you're going to be in a position too often where you're not getting the maximum benefit off of this. And obviously, to really benefit off this, you would want a lot of cards that are both colors. So it would have, you know, red and green and then 3 generic or something, so that you discount 2 generic. Still, pretty good card in the right circumstances. But at a cost of 5 mana, I can understand why it doesn't see too much play, because it's a little bit higher up on the curve for ramp discounting, stuff like that. Most people are going to want their ramp as early as possible, and then they don't even think about it once you get past turn 4 or 5. Next, Ugin the Ineffable. This is a 6-mana legendary planeswalker. It's Ugin, and it starts with 4 loyalty. The static ability is colorless spells you cast cost 2 less to cast. The +1 is exile the top card of your library face down and look at it. Create a 2/2 colorless spirit creature token. When the token leaves the battlefield, put the exiled card into your hand. And then the -3 is destroy target permanent that's 1 or more colors. So the reason why I include it in this video is because it will discount your colorless spells by 2. Now, obviously, if you happen to be playing an Eldrazi deck, all of your spells are going to be colorless. So that's good. Otherwise, you would need, if you're going to be playing a colored deck, you would need your library to be primarily artifacts. I guess the occasional Devoid spell would also get this discount, but you're not, how many Devoid spells do you really have in a deck that's not built around Devoid for some reason? This card is going to be good in artifact decks, so I imagine that a lot of the play that it does see is in those decks. The minus isn't, super, great. You wouldn't really want to include a 6-mana single target removal spell in your deck that you can only do once before this thing will end up dying. And the ability to get card advantage eventually, like a token, which when it goes away you get card advantage, that's not worth including. You're only going to include this in a deck for the static ability. And then the last card in this entire video will be Myth Unbound. It's a 3-mana, including a single green enchantment. It says your commander costs 1 less to cast for each time it's been cast from the command zone this game. Whenever your commander is put into the command zone from anywhere, draw a card. So, I don't know where you'd want this card. It feels more like a combo card, some sort of deck, like a Prosh, I guess, where you're, or what's the really stupid one where Derevi, where you can pay the alternate cost to bring him out of the command zone. So something where, some sort of combo where you are going to put the commander in the command zone and recast it and not really lose mana out of the transaction. Galta obviously has a discount built into them, so depending on what you're doing and how you're doing it, you might be able to come ahead or negate the commander cost, the commander tax naturally. So the discount is, I mean, in just a normal fair deck, just playing it straight, the discount is just going to cut your commander tax in half, which I don't know that that's valuable enough to include in a deck. The main reason why this would even make sense is for the whole draw a card whenever you put your commander into the command zone. So you have to be doing some sort of combo where you're casting it and putting it in the command zone, or maybe you do have an alternate way where, you know, without casting it, like Eureka, which isn't green, but if you have some other alternate way of getting it into play or into the graveyard from the command zone, and then you put it there so you don't care about casting it at all, but you just need to get it in and out of the command zone to draw cards. I'm sure there's at least a few different ways that you can combo this into some sort of chain, but I don't know what it is off the top of my head. I'm not interested enough to build a deck or look into that trick. That trick, whatever it is, isn't that appealing to me, but it just screams that that's what you want to do with this card. You're not going to play this as in a deck normally, naturally, to discount one card that you'll always want, but it's not guaranteed to just keep going in and out of the command zone. You might, you know, maybe there's a bounce effect that puts it to your hand. Maybe you're playing a deck and maybe the card, maybe your commander just stays in play the whole game and it never gets removed. Maybe you have a high CMC commander and you don't get it out till late. It's sort of like a cast it and win right then type of commander. Whatever the case may be, this card is, you're not going to use it for an honest mana reduction. You're just going to use it as part of a combo. So that wraps it up for this video. Thank you for joining me, and I will be back soon. Thank you.